Well, I want to welcome everybody to another edition of SIBA Reader Meet Writer. My name is Wiley Cash. I'm your host from a very warm and humid coastal North Carolina. The heat index was 109 degrees today, and I know that Daniel's joining us from Santa Fe, New Mexico, so we are in two extreme locales. So we'll both try to stay hydrated and sentient during our conversation tonight. SIBA is an organization, the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance. They represent just under 700 bookstores, independently owned bookstores across the Southeast. And perhaps you are here tonight because one of those bookstores invited you. If that's the case, please purchase Daniel's beautiful book from the independent bookstore that invited you or your favorite independent bookstore. I want to bring attention to an upcoming event we've got. On Thursday, September 10th, a week from today, we'll be hosting Carl Hoffman. He'll be talking about his book, Liar's Circus, a strange and terrifying journey into the upside-down world of Trump's MAGA rallies. I don't know what could be circus-like about that experience, or what could be lies about an experience like that. This is vodka, by the way. But tonight, we are here to talk about Daniel Nayeri and celebrate his just released gorgeous book. And perhaps tonight, while you're watching, you might have a question for Daniel. If you do, please go down to the little Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen there, type your question in. When you do, make sure to say your name and the name of your home independent bookstore, and we'll give you both a shout out when I ask Daniel the question. So that'll be a great way, if something comes to mind that you want to ask, feel free to ask it, and I will ask Daniel on your behalf. And I think I've got some students out there watching, so they better have some questions, and they better not make me look as silly as they do in class. So tonight we are welcoming Daniel Nayeri. Daniel Nayeri was born in Iran and spent some years as a refugee before immigrating to Oklahoma at age 8 with his family. He is the author of several books for young readers, including his new book, Everything Sad is Untrue, a True Story, and Straw House, Wood House, Brick House, Blow, 4 novellas. Daniel, thank you so much, man, for making time. I know you're out and about with your family and having a bookseller experience and traversing all over the place, so thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. Yeah, we're having a fascinating socially distanced book tour, but it's been good so far.
Well, I want to ask you about that toward the end of our talk. But first, can you give us just a kind of a quick summary, or what is your elevator pitch, or what is your query letter pitch for this gorgeous book? And a lot of folks listening may be here because they heard you on All Things Considered yesterday.
Right.
And I am no Mary Louise Kelly, but I'll do my best.
I also had the benefit of being edited. The joke I make when I get asked about the elevator pitch is that I used to work in a Flatiron building where the elevators were still hydraulic. And so it took like 5 minutes to get to the top. So that's what you're about to get. Yeah, the Flatiron building elevator pitch. No, I tell people the story, of course, it's an autobiographical novel of my childhood. I was born in Iran, and my mother was a very devout Muslim, but converted to Christianity and joined the underground church there. That's sort of the inciting incident. It's the central arc is that decision, and as a result, she ran afoul of the secret police, and we had to escape very quickly. We became refugees and finally got asylum to Oklahoma. The book opens there, right? It opens with this kid standing in front of a class full of, skeptical classmates and telling stories of life, what it was like, what life was like in Iran, which was distinctly better for him, right? He had a dad, they were fairly well off, and so the kids, as naturally they would, sort of have their share of skepticism, and he starts to embroider the story with the history of Iran and the legends and mythology of where he's from, and in admittedly what is probably a certain amount of self-aggrandizing as it goes, and then the story continues. The arc of the refugee experience sort of all culminates in the two worlds of storytelling, mythology, legend, and then like reality, all sort of colliding with sort of his dad. I'm spoiling the climax. His dad sort of comes for a visit, and so he's going to step out of the hype, so to speak, and step into Edmond, Oklahoma, and we'll see how it goes from there.
And this is a novel with storytelling kind of as a central theme, and pulling, like you said, myth, biography for this little boy, autobiography for you, and just trying to make sense of the world. That's why the tornado on the front is such a perfectly ordering device thematically for the book and the way it's framed. But the novel opens with a killer line: "All Persians are liars, and lying is a sin." And I learned very early on as a storyteller, being a young kid, that the most attention I got from a story was if I embellished it and I lied. Like if I took something that happened and made it even grander and bigger. And can you talk a little bit about Daniel as a storyteller, but also the storytelling tradition he's borrowing from Iranian culture or Persian culture at large? Just what kind of elements he's pulling into it that you were pulling into it?
Sure. Yeah. So it's very much as that's the question in two parts, and I'll take the first part first, which is the Khosrow, the narrator, me, that's my name, as a storyteller. What he's experiencing is that clash of culture, right? Because in America, like I think of this all the time, in the difference between like polite cultures in Iran versus in America. In America, one of the foundational like positions to have, in my opinion anyway, to take this all as mine, is the notion of being like true blue. A true blue American is like a cowboy. Like if you ask a cowboy like what's going on, like he's gonna tell it to you straight. He tells it to you straight. He's a true blue American. That's what it is. It's unvarnished. It's blunt, but it's not uncaring. That's not true. It is most caring when it is most clear. That is the exact opposite of Persian culture. Persian culture is, there's no Persian novel, I dare say, ever written that doesn't have to have a paragraph to describe and translate the concept of tarof. If you've read anything by any Iranian artist, it's actually one of my favorite things to do. It's like, in a PG-13 movie, you're only allowed to have one F word. And so screenwriters will like search for, anytime the F word comes up, they're like, you used your F word. And it's hilarious. It's just like a scavenger hunt. In Persian novels, I'll give you, it's the passage that has to explain to Western readers what tarof is. And tarof is, to a true blue American, straight out lying. But what it really is what I describe it, if I was in an undergrad class, I guess, it would be I wouldn't say annihilation, I would say depreciation performatively, so as to derive honor to your guest. So, and this is, just like in the stuff of Instagram memes, the stuff of everybody trying to pay for the meal, all that kind of cultural resonance. And really what it is in that moment, in any moment of interaction, the most important thing is who is being respected and how, not what is the most true statement I can make at this time. So Khosrow at this time is, throughout the story, he's trying to tell these stories the way you said it. He's trying to tell it with the aggrandizing embellishment of a storyteller, with all that good stuff. And he's assuming that everybody is on board. He's assuming that it's like, yeah, I'm telling you a story. And they're constantly like picking at nits and saying, well, like, what about this? And he's like, well, and he's running face first into this, like, no, that's not the purpose of our moment. The purpose of my moment is to like deliver a dynamic to you and to explain something to you and for us to be communal. And they are asking for like the letter of the law. And you can see him actually dealing with this. He doesn't necessarily think all Persians are liars, but he knows that all Persians are thought to be liars. And so the nature of, and then he starts, it's interesting to me anyway, it's interesting when he's doing the act that every memoirist does, but he's doing it under the shadow of feeling as a liar. And so he's actually going overboard, qualifying and telling you all the parts that may even be slightly untrue. Because, even one of the main themes of the story is like, the nature of your own memory is like the act of memoir is such a fraught act, right? It's not ever going to be perfectly objective. And he's having to deal with this in real time because he's having to deal with American sort of understanding of true blue at the same time. So that's, to me, what he's up to as a narrator, is just kind of bashing himself back and forth between sort of Eastern and Western modes of storytelling. But, and how that relates to the second part of your question of, the oral tradition is exactly that, is, the way that stories were sort of told to me as a kid were we're in lieu of television. Like we just didn't have that. So you would be in the one I remember most, the one that didn't make it into the manuscript. We were just talking about scenes that get cut. Was this, this gentleman who lived on my grandfather's land. The land is very large. He sort of had his own little spot, and he and his wife had never had children, and they always wanted them. They really had a heart for little kids, and there were always little kids around in the village and stuff. So he used to build these big toys out of like just scrap metal. And one of them I remember was like a Ferris wheel, and then we would all go to his house, like my mom, my father, we'd all go there. And after everybody was playing and the parents were talking, the kids would sort of tire out and come and sit down in a circle. Everybody's having tea. The phrase is souffre. We all sit on a rug on the floor. And this man would sort of start to tell stories. And the way that he would segue into a story was in that same methodology of call and response that happens in the book, where he's like alluding to something. He says, but I'll get that. I'll get to that later. It's what I think of as a very teasing sort of way of making the person ask you to tell the story 3 times at least. It's in the book, Khosrow, who's not very good at storytelling, tries to do it, but the reader can't possibly ask. So he says it, and then you can see he's sort of like, there's a silence, to me anyway, of waiting for the reader to say something to him, but there's no, the reader can't obviously speak to the author. So he'll just kind of be, there's entire threads that he just leaves off because he forgets to pick back up because there's no one there to talk to him back. You can kind of see him struggling to be a narrator as he is one. So that was a long answer, but that was that. Yeah.
One thing that I was thinking about before that, and definitely now, is this idea that about lying. And I can, speaking of the undergraduate classroom, which I'm in quite a bit, there's this Sir Philip Sidney, like the Elizabethan courtier, and I love saying courtier. It's such a smarmy word, and they believe you mentioned the Persian word of
Taros.
Yeah, and of course, the Anglo inclination is the exact opposite of that. It's sprezzatura. You've got to be the best storyteller, the best fencer, the best dancer, the best everything.
Sure.
Yeah, but he had
shout out to Castiglione.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But the idea of all writing is a lie. So you got to put it to good use. You've got to teach and delight. You've got to educate the reader in some way, but also delight them so they're not aware that they're being educated or enlightened. And I was thinking about that with this book, that a lot of American readers aren't going to understand an experience like this and how it's going to illuminate so much for them, which is, we're a very kind of a myopic nation of readers in many ways. We read very culturally, very narrowly, very regionally, oftentimes. Coming from a Southern writer, I can attest to that. And what I liked about the book was the constant invocation of you, the reader, where you're addressing the reader. There's even moments where it's like, you reader, or reader, here I will pause. What were you doing there? Were you doing what you just said, that call and response? It felt like this very, seductive's the wrong word, but this interactive interrogating of the experience, the physical experience of reading the book. Yeah. Is that what you were doing there?
Yeah, there's 2 or 3. Yeah, there's 2 reasons why he's doing that, right? Because as a personality, there are no chapter breaks in the book, and because as a personality, he vacillates between this sort of manic, get you by the cuff, wants to tell you the whole story, has all that sort of confidence that you need in order to present yourself, and then sort of one thing will cut in there, the voice of maybe a student or something, and you can watch his confidence just drain, and he's living under what he thinks of as the shame of not knowing the exact truth. This becomes shameful, right? One of the salient lines throughout it is him virtually apologizing for this book. He's saying, look, I wish I could give you the straight linear path. I wish it, because I wish it had been lived, but a patchwork text is the shame of a refugee. It feels shameful not to be able to pull out an album and give it to you as a straight line. It feels shameful not to be claimed by a family. It feels shameful. And so he's like, throughout, he's extremely aware of the reader's disdain for him, or the reader's possible, interpretation of him as the sort of the stereotype of the smarmy, lying, kind of duplicitous, just like storyteller. So he's constantly trying to audit whether or not this person is, one, paying attention, and two, not hating the experience, not sort of misunderstanding that this is all he has to offer. So he's very clearly trying to offer his best and apologizing that it's not that good throughout. And in some ways, those are the parts that refer to, Scheherazade. Like he understands that what's at stake isn't just that the reader would think less of him, or think, because he clearly, like, he signs up for who he is really early on. He says, like, I'm this kid, I'm not particularly attractive, I do this, blah, blah, blah. It's not that. It's that you would look into his character and find that wanting, right? And that to him is the exact same stakes as the king becoming bored with a Scheherazade story and sort of, sending her to the fate that, all the king's wives had before, which was death, right? To him, this is death, that you would actually think him a liar. That's why it's the most important thing to him. At the end, that's all he really even says. Like, he audits his own novel. I won't sort of spoil the end scenes, but he's clearly auditing, like, did I just tell you the truth? Did I tell you the most true thing? Mm-hmm. Did I tell you a truth within a lie? What did I just do? And if you would please, don't think of us as liars, right? Like, this is like the beginning and the end. That's where he is. So the reader's response is very clear. The only other reason the Colin response is there is because there's this other theme that goes through of, listening and speaking, the differences there. And there's a line he says where he says, would you rather a God who speaks or a God who listens? And that sort of transmutes into, would you rather a parent who speaks or a parent who listens? Which were sort of the two I had. Then the other is like, would you rather, what is speaking and listening at the same time? And he starts to understand that reading is, especially if you're bad at it, like I was, when you read, you're literally speaking out the words to yourself. Sometimes you mouth them the way I did. And you're, of course, listening to those words because those words aren't yours. So you're speaking someone else's words aloud to yourself. Yeah. So reading becomes the act of, like, prayer and audit of his person and his story that he becomes most aware of. That's why he's most like himself when he's talking to the reader.
I have two questions to go off that, but I want to remind folks, if you do have questions, go down to the Q&A tab and type your question there. Mention your name and your home bookstore, and I will ask Daniel your question at the end of our broadcast tonight. You may hear my 5-year-old, my 4-year-old over there talking about the movie I'm allowing them to watch with their headphones on. So
nice.
Speaking of me being a parent, you just mentioned parents. I know from snooping around on Instagram that you're close with your mom. Can you talk about the mom character in the book? She kind of comes out as the hero of the book. Can you talk about the role of mothers and mothering in the book?
Sure. Yeah. I used to actually, before I wrote this book, I used to tell my friends, I'm going to write a story of 4 generations of my family in which all the women are like incredible powerhouses and all the men were abject failures. And I was really obsessed with this for a while. I thought that, and I really wanted to, like, interrogate that. And then I actually started, and this was, I think, very much a 22-year-old's like elevator pitch where I thought it was like, ooh, that sounds good. And as I started to look into it and frankly, assess motherhood with the same harsh lens I had given to fatherhood, as I started looking at that over the course of sort of 10 years, I was like, oh no, my mother stands out actually as a fairly singular lens that I had sort of looked through. Hers is a story of unstoppable grit. Hers is the story of, incredible sort of overcoming of a set of challenges that I think would shatter most. but that does not extend to every generation. And in fact, the other mothers aren't necessarily, she didn't have nearly the mother I had, not to sort of speak ill of my own family, but I am very, so it morphed into a story wherein she was a lot more singular. The input, I think about this in terms of inputs and outputs, or another way to put it is, like meaning what comes into you and how you then metabolize what comes into you and how you sort of put it out. There's a lot about poop in this book, for example, and I could wax poetic about like references to Rushdie, but in a lot of ways the idea was like, what do you take in and then what do you put out in this world, right? And of course it's not just about food. Of course it's about pain. Of course it's about abuse. Of course it's about how difficult it is to not sort of lash outward in the same way that you are abused, and also the strength that I think we talk a lot about like forgiveness in terms of like a redemptive story, but we don't ever talk about how in any act of forgiving, someone's got to pay this price. The pain is happened. Sure. Someone has to pay for it, and when you forgive, you're basically just saying, okay, I'll take it. I'm going to take the pain. I'm not going to send it back. I'm not going to sort of return in kind. That's what we're going to do. She's sort of the only person in my family who tried to do that, right? She's human. I don't want to write a hagiography or anything like that, but she was the only one that I perceived that sort of unstoppability that I described. So yeah, she became very quickly in some ways the focus. Why? And she's also the focus because, hey, if she doesn't convert, none of this happens. So
Sure.
she's the inciting incident, whether we like it or not. But
yeah.
She also, as a character, she's also that. Other than that, boy, I know so little about mothering. Like I couldn't. I watched it. I delivered what happened with me, but in terms of prognosis, I got nothing for nobody.
I love that you use the term inciting incident. I mean, I guess the mother's conversion is like the stone that's thrown into the pond, and the story starts kind of rippling out. You mentioned pain and a little bit earlier when you were talking, and if we talk about the mother, we have to talk about the stepfather. And every novel has to have a hero or an anti-hero, and then every novel has to have an antagonist of sorts. And where do you see the stepfather fitting into the role of antagonist, if he is, or how do you see that character?
You mean Ray? Yeah. So Ray is my stepfather. He's an interesting guy. I tried really, really hard. This was a challenge I put in front of myself was, I used to another joke. I used to be full of vim and vigor when I was in my undergrad. I'd be like, I want to write this book, so someday Ray will show up to a signing so I can finish my business. He was a person who I've been in a lot of martial arts in my life, and I played football in Oklahoma, and it was like a lot of that early energy was like how to become physically dominant as a human, right? How to become, this is stuff I've, for what it's worth, none of this is how you should behave in the world. And all of this is stuff that you have to work out in your 30s if you didn't do it in your 20s. So I don't mean to valorize any of that kind of thinking, but it's the thinking that comes to mind. Because when you're in a house with someone like Ray, one, you're surviving him, and two, you're like, time is on my side, and I had that sort of final climax with him. It was definitely not in the book, but at the same time, I said to myself, "Look, this is weak writing. That's going to be bad. Like very clearly, turning him into a puppy kicker is not going to work out. If only if we say our first priority is to deliver a good book, not to write out my demons on the page, right?" So, and I see this happen a lot. So I said, all right, and let me lead with the story of this human that might closest explain why he was the way he was. And so if you'll note, the very first story you get of Ray is, to me, one of the most, how do you say it? One of the most deeply sad stories I've ever heard about a human, which is, he was a child of a lot of people in an area of Iran that butts up against, the Russia and Azerbaijan, and it's sort of and he had how many siblings he had? He had a 2-digit number of siblings, and he sort of, and his father really, abused him and tied him up to a tree and whipped him once. And this was a story that was given to me and was never particularly soothing to me as an excuse for his behavior, but it was an explanation of his behavior. So I tried to deliver that first, despite what I would like for everybody to think. And then I said, all right, and very quickly, it was fascinating. As I was writing that scene, my opinion of him changed greatly. He passed, by the way, over the course of writing this book, and I felt particularly ashamed for having ever said anything like I did about him showing up and any of that. So, but he was someone who, throughout the rest of the book, despite that sort of early story, is a functional, chaos machine in our lives. And Khosrow, the narrator, sort of takes him on as there's a scene that is very short that the sister sort of says, he's here because of you. He's here because mom is terrified that you won't have a male role model. And so he sort of, Khosrow takes on through the rest of the novel after that, a certain amount of guilt around Ray's existence. Like Ray would be, functionally sent away if Daniel didn't need a father figure. And so he sort of ends up getting, what is the word? He ends up, what's the word I'm trying to give for, Ray ends up being, I wouldn't compliment myself to say 3-dimensional, but let's say 2.5 dimensional in being a source of abuse and pain, but also a guilty possibility of what Daniel could become. So at the very least, he's sort of wrestling with the possibility that real humans can become these people too. Like, and he, you know what I'm saying?
Which is so much more interesting, as you said, than making him a puppy kicker.
Yeah.
He's a character that we have to contend with instead of a character we can write off as being a one-dimensional black hole of darkness, right? Even having
to be fair, he did kick puppies too, just to be clear. I've seen it.
but even having that causality of his childhood, just that like nagging thing in the reader's mind that says, well, there's a reason this guy's this way.
Yeah.
Is a nice way, not a nice way, it's a good way to present a characterization in a story instead of having, Captain Hook, just being, or Satan or Iago or whoever, and so what I want to ask before we turn to the reader's questions is, this is autobiography, this is fiction, this is memoir of sorts. What made you weave these fictional elements? And I think Ray's character is a good example of that. What caused you as a writer to make the narrative choice to delve into fiction, to round out the edge of the fiction, to bring other edges of fiction to it? Like, what was the reason? Does it go back to that aspect of telling the best story, or is it getting to the best emotion? Is it communicating the most with the reader?
Yeah, it was communicating the most with the reader is the best. Like, I've been asked this question a lot, and I'm going to steal it. Communicating the most with the reader is what I've been rounding about trying to explain, because I wrestled with this one for a long time. I wrote it initially as an adult novel, then as an essay collection, and then finally it really clicked when I was able to deliver it from the perspective of the person experiencing it, right? This sort of kid. And so I like to think the effect of that was well, one, like as an adult, looking in the past tense, there's always going to be that remove. You'll always know, in Dracula, he survived long enough to write the letter. That's, at the very least. And so it's like that kind of thing where there's a little bit of remove there, but there's also the emotional remove of having already worked a lot of this stuff out, right? You want to be there in the moment that is most traumatic, I suppose you'd say. So there's that, but I also think he sort of is able to be actually more honest by going back into that space. And I think the reason for that is he's trying to hide things from you. He's trying to say, like, he didn't cry when his thumb was broken. He didn't cry, like these things. And very clearly he did. And so it allowed for the narrator to like leak information that was, I thought, a little bit more transparent. And then lastly, fiction, I think I really enjoyed playing with like playing frankly with dialogue. Playing with, the minute I start putting dialogue in the mouths of my great-grandparents, well, I've made that up. Like, obviously. Now, it's not made up in the sense that, someone could say, like, I knew people would say, like, hey, your grandpa was like imperious and this and this and this. Sure, I can take all those character traits and extrapolate, and as a result, that's true in the sense that, you read into people go, yeah, that's totally your grandpa. You captured him, which is what I was trying to do. But that's not to say none of that happened. He didn't speak, or I don't know if I didn't have the transcripts. So the minute you start writing dialogue, I actually think the standard we were using for what is fiction and what is memoir is a standard that would probably cut the memoir section of most bookstores in half. So I'm okay with that. I think everyone should generally know what memoirs are. They're people, trying to express their own stories, which is the hardest thing to tell accurately. So I sort of wanted to just be like weirdly extremely honest by calling it fiction. that was sort of it. And then there's timeline things and things like that you try to have to, there's just stuff that I didn't necessarily have access to.
And sometimes fiction tells the truest story. I mean,
right.
There's what I always tell people, my students, when I teach, I say, you can always doubt someone's story, but you can't doubt their experience.
Right.
You can always doubt what happened, but you can't ever doubt what it felt like. And so fiction, I think, gives us a better idea, a better impression of what something feels like than a set of facts does necessarily. Yes, we have some questions here that have kind of like flowed right in with what some of the things that you've been talking about. Our first question comes from Laura. Her bookshop is the Little Bookshop in Midlothian, Virginia. She said, we loved your book, and we were wondering why you decided to write for a middle grade audience rather than an adult audience. And you just kind of answered that a little bit, even though both kids and adults alike would love it and they would identify with it. So you mentioned starting to write it as an adult novel, and what was the decision to because even a novel narrated by a child, I'm thinking of, To Kill a Mockingbird or Salvage the Bones or any book like that.
Sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of them. Even I think you sort of straddle across different things like what is it, like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, or Pigeon English. I don't know. I think he's 8 in that one. He's the youngest one I could think narrator that is for a distinctly adult audience I can think of. But yeah, so a couple of reasons. One is, first of all, it's being published as an adult novel in certain other countries. So like I actually find that we had this conversation a lot with the publisher. Middle grade narrators have this interesting opportunity to like be also an adult novel. Boy with the Striped Pajamas. Even what is it, Catcher in the Rye. More than sort of the modern YA convention. I didn't because I think adults just read YA, but middle grade has a trend that I have perceived, a very mini trend, but I do think it's going to keep happening, which is a middle grade novel will sort of do well for itself, and then they'll just have to repackage it for adults. It's like the adultification, which has been happening the other direction for a long time. You'll get like a memoir like Cheryl Strayed, and then she'll kind of need to take some stuff out and target things, and she does like a middle grade version or a young readers version. And I think it's starting to do that other way as well. So it kind of gets into like publishing, inside baseball. But, I think middle grade is that perfect spot for coming of age. So we did that. But the other was the adult novel, or the fact that it was perspective of a 12-year-old allowed me to skip some of what I would consider the brutalist aspects of that book, or of my life rather, and what it would, I don't get away with not understanding certain dynamics as an adult. like my father like imprisonment, right? Like you can tell the youngest kid in your family, like, yeah, your dad was visiting Japan for 4 years. It's like, okay. Like you can, and it can even leak that information. I don't even know if that's in the book for what it's worth. Like that information can leak to an adult reader, but if you were to just as a 30 something, you cannot get away with that level of naivete. You cannot get away with the level, and also you can't get away with like skipping and overlooking parts that did happen, but I don't necessarily think push forward the purpose of the story beyond like authorly catharsis, right? Like the purpose here was to deliver the impression and then actually deliver like some form of meaning. There are a lot of books that I sort of, and I think this was in vogue for a while in the early aughts, of writing books that were the most like, thieves get rich, saints get shot, and God don't answer prayers a lot, right? That's an Aaron Sorkin sentence, and always sticks in my head where you're like, geez, really? I mean, it's true, but it's also not at all true. It's nihilism made manifest, and it's just one of those like, all right, I get it. These get rich, saints get shot. God, it's fine, but what about the ones he does? Isn't that miraculous? I don't know. Like it's a weird sentence to say, and I think I was really very much trying to avoid that adult novel that I think I could have delivered with a larger chip on my shoulder, with a whole lot less vulnerability and a whole lot more just like bitterness. And I was like, is that really what I want to deliver? I'd like to deliver something useful, something generous. And it's like, okay, well, what can I do? On my day side, I'm a publisher. I publish like what we call like skill building books like knots, like how to make great knots, or like coding, or things like the outdoor school, camping, hiking, stuff like that. And we're very clear about the beauty of like utility, the beauty of delivering empowerment to someone in a very real sense, not empowerment as encouragement, empowerment as now I got something I didn't have. I really feel this is true of beauty as well. I really feel this is true of like great art, is it actually gives you one more tool of understanding an ugly world, right? And I was like, if a book doesn't do, if I don't do that, then I've just made them live all the parts that I lived, and then none of the redemptive elements that I didn't work through, that in some ways, like, many people spoke into my life. And so to do that, to also give okay, this happened, but now how do we turn our face to adulthood? How do we actually deliver and think? And this is absolutely pertinent to adults, in my opinion, pertinent to any age, is how do we take in a world of pain and put out something else, right? This to me felt very much a coming of age thought. So middle grade. Sorry to wax too long on that, Laura.
No, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about so many novels from the early part of the century being nihilism made manifest. And I agree with you. And, thinking about this book, your experience coming out on the other end as a tool that people can go through all these challenges and all these struggles and manifest some kind of usefulness out of it, instead of you just pointing to the fact that it exists. It almost like subverts not the expectation, but it subverts so much of the trauma and makes it useful. Yeah. Which, not to like, we're out of time, and I don't want to end on a corny note or say like, but I'm going to, like, thus is the title, everything sad is untrue. And how do we look back at this stuff and pick through it? And again, the tornado on the cover, how do we borrow all of these things of experience and history and narrative, and just make what we need to make out of it, to make the narrative a utility, like you were saying with the books you published. It was beautifully said. So.
Oh, you nailed it. I think that's exactly where the title comes from. Yeah.
Well, where are you off to next? I know you're in Santa Fe. Where are y'all traveling to next?
In Santa Fe. Next is Scottsdale, Arizona, then San Diego, then all the way up to Seattle, actually, and then over.
And how many people are you traveling with? Your whole family?
My wife and my son, who is 7. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, y'all have a blast. And thank you, man. Thank you for spending time with us tonight.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Y'all go out and get this book. It's a beautiful book, and lot of interesting things to say. So join us next time for the opposite of this book, Liar's Circus, Exile in Trumpland.
Lying is a theme, it looks like.
It is, yeah. Carl Hoffman. But thank you so much, Daniel. Have an awesome trip, man.
Thank you. Thanks
All right,
again.
good night, everybody.